What's going on, everyone? So today we are talking top 10 must get under the radar type cards. Of course, I can sit here and tell you guys, Crate Dragon's very good, Podamron's very good, Wrecker very good. But I think a lot of people who are diving into set 2 can see the tier list, can see, a lot of the content online, or perhaps have already experienced how powerful they are. These are cards that maybe you haven't played too much of set 2, or maybe haven't tried them out. But because I've been playing set 2 for the last month, almost month and a half at this point, and trying all these random ones, that they've kind of crept up more and more and more for me. And this is the list of the top 10 most under the radar cards that you gotta get, perhaps before they rise in price. If you decide to pick up any of the cards today, I have a TCG play link in the description down below. If you go ahead and use it, it helps me out as well as helps you out. Without further ado, let's talk about the first one on our list. So the first one on the list is Kuiil. Is a 2-resource Vigilance Heroism ground unit, 2/3 stat line with Restore 1. And on attack, you have to discard a card from your deck. If it shares an aspect with your base, you return it to your hand. This one's very unassuming, and when we were going through spoiler season and talking about this card initially, I think I said something along the lines of, it's good, I like the Restore 1 body, I like the potential of drawing cards, it seems like an above average 2-drop, but that might be a little bit of an understatement in of itself, as this is a card that has actually just completely carried certain matchups. If you're fighting the mid-range / controlling matchup and you happen to be in blue heroism and having a Kuiil as your 2-drop, this can draw you oftentimes 2 to 3 cards on its own, help you push in damage and prevent you from actually even taking damage yourself because of the Restore 1. But it's also not just an amazing card because it can draw you so many cards and give you options against the more controlling matchups, but because of its body, it is a way to give you additional kind of buffer against those aggro or even more aggressive decks, maybe not necessarily aggro decks, but more aggressive mid-range decks, by giving you a good body and allowing you to restore. Not only that, but it's also really good in certain decks. Ray is a specific one that's super solid with Kuiil because you can always pump it up afterwards with an experience token. And any deck that has one heavily colored, let's say, deck that fits their base, like let's say you're playing, I don't know, some sort of Mando blue, and you happen to be running a lot of blue cards because those are where the upgrades are at, and you play Kuiil, it can draw you cards even at a rate of like 70%, even higher than that, of the time when it attacks. It's really powerful, draws you cards, restores your HP, gives you a nice body, and it's a 2-drop. We're talking about a 2 resource play on turn 1. It is a really powerful one and has given me a ton of wins on its own. Inspiring Mentor is next up on our list. It's a 2-resource upgrade in Command Heroism. You attach it only to non-vehicles, and attached unit gains on attack, and when defeated, you give an experience token to another friendly unit, and it gives +1/+1. This is a card that initially I was a lot lower on. When we first saw it in spoiler season, I was like, okay, this seems like reasonable. I'm not really sure where you're going to see a lot of power in this one. But the thing with set 2 is the ability to make multiple good plays and have options for more 1-resource plays and 2-resource plays is immense. We have things like Clone Deserter or Mons Kanata on 1-resource, which is actually very good. When you looked at like set 1 aggro or more aggressive decks, you really didn't have those options. And so that restriction of having another friendly unit actually went away because you have so many units now to play in things like Sabine Green or Boba Green, for example. I think Sabine Green is a perfect example of where this card really shines, because turn 1, you make a couple plays. Turn 2, maybe you play a 2-drop and a 1-resource play. And then on turn 3, you have that Sabine flip, right? And you're almost always going to have another unit alongside her. There's very rare scenarios when you have no units on the battlefield. And what this allows you to do is potentially play Inspiring Mentor, potentially play 2 Inspiring Mentors on Sabine, give your other unit experience tokens, and go to town, basically getting in guaranteed damage, acting as like a mini for a cause, guaranteeing oftentimes 2 damage, and then guaranteeing more experience tokens afterwards because of the when defeated aspect of this. But also, it just snowballs extremely hard. And because it costs 2 resources, you also can, if you don't have like double Inspiring Mentor, follow up with Battlefield Marines or Clone Deserters or R2s and build your board out still because of how many more options we have. If you think about what this card does, let's say you have some random like Sundari Peacekeeper, and then you flip Sabine, you go with Inspiring Mentor, your opponent tries to go ahead and kill one of your earlier units and probably can't kill Sundari Peacekeeper because that's a hard one to kill. You put Inspiring Mentor on Sabine, you attack in, you give an experience to Sundari Peacekeeper, boom, suddenly you get 2 additional damage because of +1/+1 and the experience token on Sundari Peacekeeper. You can follow up with Inspiring Mentor with like a Battlefield Marine. And then even if they deal with Sabine immediately, guess what? That's +1 damage to whatever your next attacker could be, or maybe another unit that will eventually attack that turn. So kind of oftentimes, not guaranteed, but oftentimes we'll get in for 3 damage. And then if you flip Sabine after they use their resources, it at least guarantees you 2 experience tokens, which is really powerful, which often ends up being 2 damage because +1/+1 on Sabine and the +1/+1 on another unit. And that's really powerful if you just look at it from that angle. So really powerful upgrade and definitely a lot higher on my list. This next one, I have basically put some number of copies in any green deck I have built in set 2, and it has not disappointed any of the times I have done so. Time intervention, a 1 resource event in command, so neutral, and you're able to play a unit from your hand and you give it ambush for this phase. Remember, you have to pay the cost, so it's basically +1 resource to give something ambush, or you could put it in your resource pile and smuggle it out for 2 resources, so give any unit ambush for 2 additional resources. Now, one of the things that oftentimes is compared to this is Fennec. Like, why isn't Fennec good, but this card is good? The restriction of having it be a 4 cost or less with Fennec completely ruins why ambush is so powerful. When you're able to ambush out big threats, you can completely change the game for especially mid-range to ramp decks where you could have ambushed a Reinforcement Walker or an Emperor Palpatine or whatever you want that's huge, that has a board impacting play that allows you to kind of reset board state and end up outvaluing your opponent. But it's not just good in the mid-range or ramp decks. It's also exceptionally good in any aggro deck, right? Where you're playing Sabine and you're able to essentially, I use the term ECL because ECL gives ambush to something, but you're able to give ambush to things like Poe Dameron or Wrecker, which can completely end the game on their own, and all from your resource pile for 2 additional resources. Now, the resourcing aspect of this usually comes into play with the ramp decks because you're going to get more value out of your resource pile, which you usually can take advantage of because, well, your cards are used for ramp and then you have your big payoffs, and then you're kind of just drawing off the top of your deck. And then in the aggro deck cases, well, you can kind of just play this out of your hand. You're trading essentially card advantage for immediate board presence and immediate outplay potential, which is really powerful because aggro decks usually don't get through all their cards in their hand anyway. So really powerful. And if you haven't played with this card yet, you could probably slap 3 of these in any green deck anywhere, as long as you have units in your deck, and you're going to be pretty happy with it. Ketsu Onyo is a 2 resource heroism aggression ground unit, 3/2 Saboteur, and when this unit deals combat damage to a base, you can defeat and upgrade that cost 2 or less. If you've seen a lot of the red based heroism decks that I've played, or heck, even the Mandalorian decks that I've played, you will know how powerful Ketsu Onyo is. Anytime you find yourself against a Rey or a Tarkin, you're just going to be getting free value, period, in that you are just attacking into their base, defeating experience tokens on your opponent's units, which completely nullifies their entire leader, which is crazy. There's even better scenarios where you're defeating things like Mandalorian Armor, shield tokens from Qi'ra, or things like Devotions, right? Sometimes it just randomly hits upgrades, like actual cards. And if you think about what the base level of this card is, it's a 3/2 Saboteur, and oftentimes, Underworld, Bounty Hunter, and Mandalorian are all relevant tags. I would say for heroism aggression, Mandalorian's probably the most relevant tag, but at a base level, it's a 3/2 Saboteur, which allows you to bypass Sentinels if you do so choose, which there is a lot of situations where that is relevant. I've seen people try to play Child Sin and slowly you get to whittle down the Child Sin because of Saboteur and get in damage. So that could be a huge one. But overall, this is a card that at its base level, you're just like, okay, I played like a Viper Probe Droid type card where it's good. I'm not mad. I played a 3/2 on turn 1. No big deal. And then in some matchups, it completely wins the game on its own. It is absolutely absurd, especially if you're seeing Tarkin Tarkin Yellows or Ray Reds or things like that coming around, this card is the card you're looking for as much as you possibly can against those matchups because it completely hoses them. This next one's a little bit of a cheat because I know the title says set 2 cards, but technically disabling Fang Fighter actually is in set 2 as well. It's a 3 resource space unit in aggression. It's a 3/2, and when played you may defeat and upgrade. Now, one of the things that this is now relevant for is Mandalorian decks, right? This has the Mandalorian tag, which didn't really matter before, but any sort of Mandalorian synergies, maybe you're playing Bo-Katan or maybe you're playing Darksaber, suddenly this thing can actually synergize with those cards. But if you look at the base level of this card, again, it's a 3 resource space unit as a 3/2. So similar to Ketsu Onyo, okay, I'm just playing this and I'm not too upset. It's still a unit that was generally going to hit for reasonable amounts of damage and something that your opponent has to deal with, otherwise they will eventually die. But the defeating and upgrade part is exceptionally relevant. Traitorous is better than ever. Darksaber, really prevalent upgrade. You have things like shield tokens from Qi'ra. You have things like Rey and Tarkin running around. If this just hits an experience token, you're not like upset. That's like a reasonable thing to do. If this hits a devotion or a Mandalorian armor, you're like, wow, that was good. If this hits a Darksaber or a Traitorous, heck, we've even seen hitting Traitorouses or Entrenched from set 1, you are ecstatic. And I have seen this hit more Darksabers than I can count. Jedi lightsabers than I can count, even things like Luke's lightsaber and Vader's lightsaber. I've seen jetpacks being hit with this. I've seen hot shot blasters being hit with this. There are just so many upgrades nowadays that this thing almost always has a target. And even if it doesn't, as well, with Ketsu Onyo, you're playing a 3/2 with space. It's pretty solid regardless. Next one on our list is probably the least under the radar out of any of the cards that I've talked about today, and that is Lurking TIE Phantom. But I had to mention it because it does something entirely unique, and the more I see this card, the more I'm like, ooh, none of these things work. It's a 3 resource cunning villainy space unit. It's a 2/2 and it has rate 2, but the key line of text is that it can't be captured, damaged, or defeated by enemy card abilities. So the most common ones are, well, it can't be Power the Darksided, for example. It can't really be defeated by a control deck in general, but Power the Darkside is one of the most common things to see at that turn. It can't be hit by Overwhelming Barrage. It can't be pinged by Cad Bane. It can't be hit by Bosk. It can't be hit by your Bo-Katan. There's just so many random things that you're thinking about, like, wow, I can't actually do anything about this. Now, the downside of this is that it still dies in combat and it can just get killed by the fact that it's a 2/2. But if you have things like Tarkin Yellow supporting it, where you're playing TIE Advanced and you're trying to buff it up, then it becomes a serious threat. And it's one of the reasons why Traitorous has gotten so good, because it's one of the ways that you can actually deal with TIE Phantom. But this is a card that kind of solves the Voltron problem. And when I say Voltron, I mean basically getting one unit, putting a bunch of upgrades or experience on it, and then just using that unit to kind of go through the entire game. Before, we would see things like Power the Dark Side and Takedowns and Fell the Dragons and Rivals Fall and all this stuff and different type of stuff to just remove that option for us. And TIE Phantom gets around that by being basically only able to be killed by combat damage or be stolen. And that makes it an extremely unique card and a very powerful card that has literally spawned, I would say, an entire archetype, which is the Tarkin Yellow deck that we start to see with this card in it. Qi'ra is a personal favorite of mine. She's a 4 resource ground unit in Cunning Heroism. She's a 3/5, and when she's played, you can look at an opponent's hand, name a card, and when she is in play, that card costs 3 more for your opponents to play. This is exceptional in basically any sort of tempo deck. Any deck that's looking to put units on the battlefield while also disrupting your opponent. That is kind of what you're looking to do. You don't want to just be sitting back and disrupting your opponent, right? Why? Because you don't have pressure on them. You don't want to just be putting pressure on your opponent because oftentimes they can interact and probably play more things that are more valuable and can outclass your units. The middle ground is where Qi'ra is, and you want to be disrupting while putting pressure on, and that's exactly what Qi'ra does. The decks that I've seen this be the most prevalent is like a Han deck, where you're able to accelerate her out on turn 2 and just completely disrupt your opponent's overall plan. according to, or rather not according to, but comparatively to Bazine, who's a card that a lot of people like to play, she doesn't draw you an additional card. It just completely messes up your overall turn and doesn't even draw you into something that you could potentially play instead, which often does happen. If they have one play to make and you play Qi'ra and disrupt that, it's completely shattering. It basically allowed you to remove 3 of their resources from the game for that turn. That is absolutely absurd. And in some other cases, you can play this a little bit later on and then hit big and powerful cards like Overwhelming Barrage that people set up for, or Darth Vader's, or Maul's, or Obi-Wan's, and that type of stuff, where you're able to just stall off your opponent just enough to where you can finish out the game with the pressure you're applying. Qi'ra has been absolutely amazing, and even more so in things like Han. Jetpack's next. It's a 2 resource upgrade in Cunning. You can only attach it to non-vehicle units, and when you play it, you give a shield token to attached unit, and at the start of the regroup phase, you defeat that token. So essentially, you play this, and then for that turn, you're able to attack with that shield token, and well, if you don't get that shield token destroyed by that phase, it's just going to go away anyways. And it has Smuggle for 4 resources and Cunning, and it's +2/+0. Now, this is probably a card that has been the most surprising for me. That's why I say it's under the radar. This is a card that's been just increasingly good, and it's really good because of the smuggle aspect. Now, of course, it is fine if you play it for 2 resources from your hand, you give a shield token to something, you end up getting a nice trade in, or kill a unit and save your own unit because it has a shield token. The thing that I really like about this is in those aggro decks or in those tempo decks, using your resources from your resource pile is exceptionally powerful, because oftentimes the downside of tempo decks is that you have to trade your cards or your overall presence in the game for immediate advantage but late game downside, and this mitigates that heavily. And this is one of the most powerful cards to do it, because you're able to get permanent extra power on something like maybe a leader, and be able to keep that leader alive after you've gone ahead and pumped it up. Something like a Hotshot Blaster is also good for this, but we already know how good that card actually is. This is like a tier down from that, but Hotshot Blaster is one of the most important ones because you can immediately attack with it. It basically removes the downside of pumping up your units. But Jetpack does something similar in that you can't attack with it immediately, but it protects it with a shield token, which is extremely relevant as well. And in some cases, it's important to just kill off a unit and keep your unit around because of that shield token. So I've been really impressed with this, especially in the more aggro and tempo decks. Jetpack has been super powerful. I had to give a special spot to Jabba's Rancor here. This is a ground unit, 8 resources in command villainy, 9/9. If you control Jabba, now this is important, it can be as your leader or as a unit. It costs 1 less to play, and then when played or on attack, you deal 3 damage to another friendly ground unit and deal 3 damage to an enemy ground unit. Remember, if you have no other friendly ground units, you do not have to deal 3 damage to something to get that 3 damage from an enemy ground unit. You just resolve as much as you can of that ability, which is extremely important. Now, of course, in Jabba decks, this comes down to 7 resources, which is absolutely absurd. But the reason why I found this card to be so powerful is because of that 3 damage. It has so many stats on this thing that it basically doesn't die to anything. Yes, it can die to like Wrecker, for example, which you see frequently, also at 6 resources, which is a little bit earlier than Jabba's Rancor, but it trades with it. It doesn't just die to it, which is extremely important. But it can take out things like Crate Dragon, which is one of your few answers to Crate Dragon. Just play a big, beefy unit. But in specific Jabba decks, this ends up just taking over the game. I've tried this outside of Jabba, and it's still really good on 8 resources. If you think about what other 8 resource plays that we're looking at, I think of like Home One. I think of Reinforcement Walker. Those are kind of the 2 cards that I think of from set 1 oftentimes. Of course, there are other plays that you could have made, but those are the ones that I've seen be kind of where this unit would be at. Of course, your Reinforcement Walker was the most common one in like Boba Green, for example, or in Vader Green. Jabba's Rancor can easily take that spot because what Reinforcement Walker does is help you get additional cards for later on in the game, but that 6 power can sometimes be a big downside. And it doesn't immediately clear out units on the battlefield, right? Sometimes that 3 damage is going to save you more HP than the 3 HP that your Reinforcement Walker would have healed and this card ends up just being exceptional for that. Really powerful kind of ramp target, and I'm surprised I'm not seeing more people play it, but that's maybe because they haven't played with the Jabba's Rancor themselves. And the last card on our list is Mandalorian Armor. 2 resource upgrade in Vigilance. Attach it to a non-vehicle unit. When you play it, if attached unit is a Mandalorian, you give a shield token to that unit, and it gives +1/+3. So if we talk about the stat line, first off, this is a much more defensive oriented upgrade. +1/+3 is extremely relevant. And actually, usually what this allows you to do is kill something and then potentially keep it around to kill another thing and have it survive through both of those combats. Or just kill something, have it survive, and then get some really other nice value trades later on. Of course, if it's a Mandalorian, you're kind of killing things for free because you get that shield token as well. And that's the big thing. When I first looked at this card, I was not really convinced that we were going to see enough Mandalorians to see Mandalorian Armor work. But one of the most powerful things I've seen anyone do in set 2 is play a Fen Rao on turn 5, put a Mandalorian Armor on Fen Rao, which makes it then, instead of a 5/6, now a 6/9, and give something -2/-2, and put a shield token on Fen Rao. It's absolutely absurd. And you all saw with the Bo-Katan deck that I made a little bit ago, as well as the Mandalorian deck, and even heck, the Gar Saxon deck, I believe we played it in that one. There are just so many situations where this just takes over the game. You play like a Ketsu Onyo. You put a Mandalorian Armor on Ketsu Onyo, she becomes a 4/5 with the shield token. It's absolutely absurd, and this upgrade has been incredibly powerful. If there were more Mandalorians, I could see this be even better. And perhaps if it was out of blue, maybe, but most Mandalorians are already blue. Maybe if it was in like red or something, it could be more interesting. You could maybe play it in like Sabine green, for example. Regardless, it is super powerful, and if you're in the deck for it where you have Mandalorians, well, this is a card you might want to consider slotting in. Overall, there are a lot of cards that I think are flying under the radar, and these are just a couple of different options. I have personally played with all of these cards here a numerous amount of times over the past couple of weeks, and you'll probably have seen it on the videos that I've posted and why I play these cards, because they just take over the games in a lot of situations. And because of that, I think that you all should at least give them a try. And almost all of them are pretty cheap. Even the rares like Qi'ra or Inspiring Mentor or Mandalorian Armor come to about like $1 or like $2 or something like that. And of course, most of these are uncommons regardless. So these are like must-gets that I think you should get before maybe they rise up. The uncommons come into like $1 or something like that. You don't want that to happen because, well, these are like a few cents right now, which is kind of nice. Anyways, thanks for watching, everyone. Let me know what your thoughts are. And are there any cards that I don't have on my list that you think are absolutely absurd, maybe under the radar must-gets from set 2? Let me know in the comment section down below, and I will see you all for the next video.